This is a unique phenomenon in human history.
C'est une crise, comme vous l'avez dit, d'un genre très particulier parce que c'est la première fois dans l'histoire humaine que face à un danger mortel pour un certain nombre de gens, on a décidé d'arrêter l'économie.
On est dans l'instant permanent.
300,000 people can die every day from hunger.
C'est aussi aux citoyens de dire halte. Je suis surpris par l'obéissance des masses.
The importance of forming judgment, the importance of saying, I will wait to see a transcript before I comment.
Ces plaintes ont quelque chose de totalement indécent.
The coronavirus has had an impact on humanity as a whole.
Hi, Vlad. It's great to be here with you. The news about Navalny is always changing, and we are just looking at the news now. We see that Yulia Navalny is on an airplane on her way to Germany. So this story definitely has legs, and this is not the final conversation on the subject. I got to know Vlad in Ukraine several years ago as a reporter, and you don't have a better or a more interesting commentator. So it's really a joy to be here with you. And I spent some time at LSE, so I'm thrilled to also be with some LSE students today. Vlad, I'd like to start the conversation with an obvious question. As we watch the situation with Alexeï Navalny, I have to ask, is Alexeï Navalny really a threat to Vladimir Putin? And just how secure is Putin's regime today?
Thank you for having me, Sophie, and hello, Melinda. Melinda's actually my boss at the Atlantic Council, which I joined not so long ago, about 6 months ago, when she helped get me out of Belarus when things got a bit hairy. So to start off with whether Navalny is an actual politician or a blogger, for lots of Russians, he was an anti-corruption blogger for a very long time. So lots of people in the West see him as the head of the opposition. And in a way, that's true now that he returned and he is a heroic figure and he has established himself just by virtue of his heroism and virility as the indispensable figure for the political opposition, which has not existed since Boris Nemtsov was killed. There's not been a person who can unify the many squabbling factions of the Russian opposition. There's been not one person that everybody could talk to. Even the people who don't like Navalny, and there's a lot of them in the Russian opposition circles, respect him now as uncontested leader of what was until now a fractious opposition. So he was a blogger, it's true. He was an anti-corruption activist, it's true. He was, let's say, a regional politician, it's true. But now with his return and the fact that every single embassy and president, prime minister that will be speaking to President Putin from now on will mention his fate, he's unconditionally, categorically the Solzhenitsyn of our time, with the same kind of, let's say, unappetizing past utterances for some people, but also unambiguously the leader of the opposition now.
Okay, Vlad, you went there, so I'm going to go there now. Let's talk about Navalny. He's heroic, he's strong. He returned to Russia after being poisoned, but people have broken with him. You said he's controversial because he's participated in Russian nationalist marches. He's called Central Asians cockroaches. Why doesn't more Western reporting take into account the full picture of Navalny? It seems like a lot of it is hero worship now. Do you agree with that?
Well, we should always be skeptical of our heroes. It's true. On the other hand, a lot of these things that he said, which were questionable, he said when he was younger, let's say in his late 20s. I mean, he didn't say them when he was 19. He said them in his late 20s and early 30s. So he was an adult, and he should stand by his own words. I'm not one of those in the opposition or a commentator or a Russian who thinks that he is a racist. He did have some unfortunate commentary, which he's absolutely muted in the last 12 years. I've not seen him say these kinds of things since 2008. Is he probably still a nationalist? Yeah, he's very much a nationalist. What that means in the West and what that means in the context of decommunization and post-imperialist Eastern European space is completely different. So when people think of nationalism in West Europe or in America or in Canada, that's unambiguously kind of a bad thing for a lot of people. In Ukraine or Lithuania or in Belarus or Russia, It just means someone who really, really loves their country. So, and a lot of people from very kind of pro-government circles are now using those arguments to discount his influence. So I'm really careful about going there.
Okay. Fair enough. Vlad, tell us a little bit, remind us, bring us up to speed. So a lot has happened in Russia over the past 3 weeks. Navalny came to Moscow. He's arrested. He released a video detailing Putin's corruption, and approximately, I think, more than 100 million Russians have seen this. Now, we hear over and over again in the West that Russians are sick of corruption. It's not an issue that moves them. I know you've seen the video. Not all of us have seen it. Why is the video significant? Is it significant? And what's on the video that Navalny released after he after he was sentenced?
So the video is very much worth seeing because it explains to ordinary people in Russia and outside of Russia the way corruption actually works. And there's a paper trail, and like all these investigations that Bellingcat and others have been doing, it's completely incontrovertible. There's just so many papers and so many interviews and so many facts that nobody who watches this, who wants to go through them actually themselves, can come to the conclusion that the investigation is fake. Although Levanda Institute, which is of course impeccable in terms of their polling, has figured out that of the Russians who have watched the video, about a third of them don't believe it's true. Statistics are very clear. Actually, the most interesting part of the statistics is that 3% of the people who watched it and saw the tremendous billion-dollar palace that he built on the side of the peninsula actually respect him more. That's how the president should live, in a billion-dollar palace.
Vlad, I think the thing that was striking to me is that Putin's circle hasn't changed a lot, right? That the people who were with him in Dresden are a lot of the same people who are with him now. That's one of the more interesting things that came out in the very detailed video that Navalny did.
Yeah, before this, a lot of people really didn't know what he had been up to in his very formative East German years. I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union was very, very difficult for him, and he had a very difficult transition in the early 90s, like a lot of people did. But also those last years, during the twilight years of East Germany, with his intelligence contacts with the Stasi, that was very, very, very much formative for him also. And the only way you could have really known about those things if you maybe read Karen Dawish's book from 2014, Putin's Kleptocracy. And outside of very, very, very special circles, even in the West, most people didn't know what he was up to. So it is true that he brought a lot of the people that he was working with, oftentimes the very people who were working in the next cabinet with him, into power with him. And the group of people that he had compiled to work when he was the second man in St. Petersburg in the 90s, those are the people that he brought with him along into Moscow. He doesn't really trust new people so much. I don't think he probably trusts anybody, but he has a core group of people that he grew up with in his childhood that he feels very sentimental to. He has a core group of intelligence people that he knew in the Stasi days, often mid-level people. They were not high-level people in the end of the Soviet years. And people from the St. Petersburg years, whether political people or semi-mob fixers who helped him run the city in the 90s. Those are the people he trusts. Those are the people that he brought into power with him. And those are the people that he has handed billion-dollar fortunes to, often holding money that probably belongs to him and or his family.
Absolutely. I liked one other bit of the Navalny film. I think his sarcasm really comes across well in it. He's standing in Germany and he's reminding the audience that Putin is no Bond. He was a low-level KGB officer in Germany. Let's not pretend that he was something great, and that Putin sort of rewritten his biography. If you haven't had a chance to watch the Navalny video, you can watch it on YouTube and get a pretty good sense of who he is and his sort of style. I really recommend it, and I think Vlad enjoyed it as well. You would get a feel for, I think we have to put one more plug in. You put a plug in for Karen Dawish's book. I would also put a plug in for Fiona Hill's book on Putin as well. It's also quite good. And I think she did a good job on the FSB years. Let's go back to Navalny though. Vlad, Navalny has been sentenced. Sophia mentioned this. How strong is Russia's opposition without him? Is he still the leader or has someone else emerged in his place?
I think he's definitely kind of I mean, again, back to the hero worship metaphors, but he's definitely sort of a soldier. He was a Solzhenitsyn figure when he was coming back, and now he's going to be the Nelson Mandela figure in prison, where he's continuously the well of gravity around which other interplanetary bodies orbit. Even when he's not in the conversation, obviously you can't really talk to him and call him up if you're running a regional Navalny headquarters, find out what he actually thinks about a particular issue. His lieutenants are now in charge. A lot of those people are very much under house arrest. It's very difficult to talk to them now because actually that's a violation of their house arrest. If they pick up a phone from someone like you or someone like me, they go straight to jail. There are a couple of people who are outside the country, like his right-hand man, Leonid Volkov, who the Russians just announced a arrest warrant for in the CIS countries. That gentleman probably won't be going back from Lithuania or London. I think he is now. It's very much people like Lyubov Sobol, the lawyer, who is fantastically glamorous and generous and exciting personality, who are going to be running the show. Mrs. Navalny just fled the country, as we saw an hour before this podcast Zoom began. It's very much going to be people on the regional headquarters level who are going to be in charge of building regional infrastructure now. And that's where the game really is.
I read some people say that it doesn't really matter if Navalny's in or out, that this group knows what it needs to do and it can do what it needs to do, whether he's in country or in jail. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah, I absolutely do. They've been building this infrastructure for 10 years. And by this infrastructure, we have to make a division between the actual Fond for Борьбы с коррупцией, which is the fund for anti-corruption fighting, and the Navalny does have his own organization, and he does have the anti-corruption fund. These are, I don't know if the firewall between them is rock solid, but these are two different organizations doing interdependent but different work. There are people who are doing anti-corruption work, and there are people who are trying to actually get something like a Navalny movement and or party going on the regional level. They've been somewhat successful, by the way. In Tomsk and Novosibirsk, they have gotten people into the city council, and they've gotten local deputies elected. So they've had some regional successes in Siberia and in other parts of Russia. And it's important to remember that there's been no wide-ranging across the 11 time zones of Russia. It's a really big country. Movement like we saw in the last 3 weeks, where in 120 cities you got demonstrators coming out of city squares. It used to be that people in Moscow would demonstrate, but it didn't mean anything in the regions, or people in the regions had localized protests where people in Moscow didn't notice this. Navalny, for the first time since about 2011, 2012, got people in the regions and people in Moscow marching together in unison. So it's very, very, very much an accelerant. It's very much a new thing. It's a new phenomenon. It's something that hasn't happened in a while.
Okay, but Vlad, so what? Right? There's people in the streets. They're all over the country. There's going to be elections this fall. The opposition is not going to be allowed to stand on the elections. Navalny's in prison. What's the strategy? I don't get it. I know that the support for support for Putin has fallen between about 18 to 40, but that doesn't necessarily translate at the ballot box. And even if it does, the Russian government is going to prevent opposition people from getting on. So help us understand what the strategy is.
So for the first 2 weeks after Navalny was imprisoned, there was tried and imprisoned, and the trial was actually really silly. It was done in the back of a provincial police station. It was really desperate looking and odd looking. I'm not sure why it happened in that case, in that way. So the first 2 weeks, the opposition showed muscle by calling the people onto the streets. And they came out in large numbers in at least 120, 130 cities, maybe as many as 150 towns and cities. And more than 100,000 people protested, which is not nothing. So some protests are as much as 200,000 across the country, but probably more like 150. But it didn't really matter in the long term because they can't keep doing this. It's not like Belarus, where people will come out on the street every single Saturday, every single Sunday. It's just a different country, and it's also really cold in Russia, in case people haven't noticed. I don't want to, some of those protests in the middle of January, in Siberia, it was negative 52 Celsius. how many times are you willing to go out into the street to fight the riot cops in negative 52 Celsius weather? I'm only willing to do it twice myself. So they've put off the protests until the spring, which is obviously the correct thing to do in the middle of a country as cold in Russia, with a security apparatus and state security apparatus as extensive as the Russian is. They're not able to foment the same numbers of the population to come out in the streets as the Belarusians are, where 80% of a population is against the regime. They just aren't. And the Russians have just exponentially more interior ministry troops and FSB people and the Nacgvardia, all these security forces. The Belarusian army is 60,000 strong, whereas the Russian army, not even keeping all the myriad internal ministry forces and National Guard and Presidential Guard troops, is like 1.5 million or 1.2 million. So Russia is just an exponentially more armed and authoritarian country in terms of just how many men they have with guns,
Sure. Go back to Navalny for a second. Do you expect him to stay in prison his entire sentence? Do you think they'll poison him? What do you expect?
I don't know. I don't think anyone knows if Putin is willing to kill him. That would really be the next step in bad relations with the West. And I'm sure that he, being a very calculating fellow who calibrates the amount of violence that he uses in every instance, understands that he can't quite do that without breaching some sort of red line. I think he's going to stay in prison for a long time because he is, of course, now the leader of the opposition. 2.8 years, which is what he got, brings us right to the cusp of a 2024 presidential elections. So I don't know if he'll be allowed to contest them, or if he has. We could just do the math, how many months it is until the presidential election. You could also just give him, 6-month extension for slipping on a banana peel or bad behavior in prison.
Or put him in a cell with someone who has COVID, right? I mean, that's another easy thing to do. That's a piece of cake. Oops, he got COVID.
COVID.
It wasn't us. It happens, right? Everyone knows that Russian prisons are not nice places. Put him in a prison where there's a huge amount of COVID. I know you said that the protest movements have been delayed until the spring, but Navalny's group is calling people to come out on Valentine's Day. What are they asking people to do? Tell us about that.
They're asking for the population to come out into their courtyards at a certain time and to make a little heart like the kind that he sent his wife from the glass cage right before they took him away to the penal colony. Basically, they want people to take out their flashlights or their iPhone or their camera and make lights. And this is, again, a way of keeping people from actually going out into the streets and having to fight police officers. A lot of people don't want to do that. Fighting with interior ministry troops in the middle of winter is very painful. It could lead to long-term problems for you, not just career-wise or health-wise. It could be very bad for you. But this is a way for people who are more highly risk-prone to show that they are in favor of the movement. It's also a very useful way to gauge in the open sphere, in public, what their actual numbers are. We don't know if 10% or 30% of a population supports them. Those are very different numbers,
One other interesting thing that we haven't talked about is the social contract that Putin has had with the Russian people. So basically, he said, I'll keep things afloat, and in exchange, you're not going to have a whole lot of civil liberties. But the Russian economy hasn't grown. The price of natural resources is not good. And we saw this week or last week, they're talking about doing more social handouts. Do you think that social contract can stay in place given Russia's anemic economic growth? What do you expect Putin to do?
So Navalny comes back and he accelerates the slow decay of the old system to the point where new things have to happen. It looked very much like the system was out of ideas, the system was anemic, the system was not doing so good at making these national growth projects, infrastructure projects, transition into positive feelings towards the regime. They're going to have to figure out ways in order to get the population back on board. The previous social contract, growing oil prices, freedom to travel abroad, to take your money outside the country, the beautification of cities, especially St. Petersburg and Moscow. They're just gleaming, the city centers now. That stuff was great for a while, but the glow has really, just come off. And it seems to me that the Russian population has a lot of different sorts of grievances, all sorts of grievances, from south to west, from wealthy to impoverished. All sorts of different people have different kinds of grievances that Navalny tapped into. He's just saying, you don't have to be in favor of me. You don't have to want Putin to leave. You don't want liberal democracy. You don't want an orange revolution, quote unquote. You just want to say, hey, I'm unhappy. Things aren't going great, and they haven't been. You're going to go out into the streets and you're going to say, hey, I'm unhappy. So a lot of different sorts of people from all different sectors of a society have been emboldened to say, I have a personal beef with the system. I want things to change. So the Kremlin very much understands this. They understand that the COVID response, would say, wasn't great, but now that they have one of the good vaccines, people are happy again. And if they're exporting vaccines, it looks good. They understood that the victories in Syria, in Ukraine, the nationalistic good feeling, the kumbaya feeling over that has dispelled itself after a couple of years. Nobody cares anymore about Crimea. It's been 6 or 7 years. The national glow of returning Crimea, quote unquote, home has dispersed. They're going to have to come up with new solutions. They're going to have to raise pensions. They're going to have to create bread and circuses. They're going to have to create new kinds of incentives for people to tolerate the bad and look at the good, of which there is some, of course.
Great. Thank you. That's really helpful. You mentioned Minsk, and you've been in Minsk recently reporting there on the ground. And I encourage everyone in our webinar to read your dispatches. They're really excellent. Tell me this. Do you see links between the protests in Belarus and in Russia? I know the Belarusian flag has been in Khabarovsk, which is in Far East Russia. I know that people are wearing red. It's the same color that they're wearing in Belarus. Are there other linkages? Are people talking to each other? What's going on?
So there were Belarusian flags in Khabarovsk, and when I was there in August until I had to leave under duress, there were also people carrying Khabarovsk signs in Minsk, which was fascinating. The two protest movements are absolutely looking at each other and learning from each other. The repression in Belarus is just crude and unsophisticated compared to what the Russians do. President Lukashenko, well,
we don't call it that anymore, Vlad.
We don't call that anymore, right? Although we don't really know what the numbers are for Tikhanovskaya because there's no one actually ever counted. I'm sure he lost the election by a factor of 5-1, but no one's counted the votes. So how can you call her president? Well, of course, she's the representative of Free Belarus.
We call her Democratic leader. That's all we call her.
Yeah, okay.
We can debate the semantics. Okay, what did people tell you when you were on the ground in Minsk about what's happening, the unrest in Russia?
They were very much fascinated with democracy in Russia, and they were very much afraid of Russian tanks and Russian special forces coming in, like they have in Ukraine. But more than that, the protest movement in Russia explicitly calibrates the amount of violence and the amount of repression they're willing to use on what they saw happen in Belarus. And the Belarusians are explicitly learning from the Russian protest movements. That's fascinating. It's also very valid because the Russians understand that they have to use the same kinds of dispersed methods of having protests in the neighborhoods that the Belarusians came up with, because it's been 6 months and they haven't really accomplished much, in terms of getting him to leave.
The opposition movement.
Yes.
Yeah. Something like only 350 police officers have defected in Minsk. I don't want to dwell too much on the situation in Minsk. You and I could do an entirely different conversation on that. But one other question related to Russia. If the Belarusian opposition can get rid of Lukashenko, what does that mean for Russia? Will that give the democratic movement in Russia some momentum, or what do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think a lot more people will come out into the streets. Actually ensures that the Russians are going to be even more forthright about not allowing Lukashenko to leave with quote unquote street violence or from the street,
Okay, Vlad, let's go to Ukraine now, where you've also reported related to Navalny. This is another sort of unpleasant question, but how have your Ukrainian friends and colleagues reacted to Navalny, given his views on Crimea and his Russian nationalist bent?
It's mostly been skepticism, I have to tell you. The fact that he's a dyed-in-the-wool Russian nationalist doesn't make him popular in Kiev or Kharkiv or Lviv, especially. A young person I was talking to was interviewing me for a newspaper yesterday, a 26-year-old activist. I asked him, what number of your friends in your social media Facebook profile, when you just read their posts like Navalny or think that he's a threat to Ukraine, he said about 70% of my people in my Facebook groups think that Navalny is now a friend of ours and that we should not be warm to him. I think that's probably true.
Wow. Yeah, it's going to probably depend on which part of Ukraine as well. Tell me about this. Navalny's team has published a list sanctions. It's about 30 or 35 people and their close associates of Putin for the EU and the US to consider. Would these sanctions be effective? And to make it more specific to Britain, since we have a bunch of people from London on the line, I saw that someone is urging Johnson to consider sanctions. They sent him this list. Is there any hope to think that the British government would put these sanctions in place and actually crack down on Russian money?
That list is a wish list. The 35 people on the list are 1/3 just regime apparatchiks and FSB people, generals, that kind of stuff. 1/3 obvious people to sanction, i.e. the people that actually carried out the assassination attempt on Navalny, the judges who sentenced him, the interior ministry people, mid to high level interior ministry people who cracked down on him. So those 1/3 are easy enough to sanction. The last third is just a who's who of the ruling regime, from President Putin to Medvedev to Sechin. That's like sending Santa Claus a wish list. I mean, it's just not going to happen, you know?
Okay, fair enough. I have one last question for you, then we're going to bring the audience in, and Sophia will come back on. Please explain this to me, because I see a potential growing conflict. Germany wants to push ahead with Nord Stream 2, and Merkel has come out and said that. She said, I'm going to call Biden. We're going to talk about this. We know that Macron he wants a normal relationship with Russia. He's a lot softer than the United States. How do you expect the U.S. and the EU to differ in their responses to the Navalny situation? We've seen the G7 issue a statement, and they basically said, every time we talk to you, Vladimir Putin, we're going to bring up Navalny. But what does it mean when you dig in on some of these more difficult policy questions?
So it's very much the case that there's going to be a growing divide between some Europeans and other Europeans, let alone between the Europeans and the Americans. The incoming Biden administration, I don't need to tell you, at the Atlantic Council, is very hawkish, especially everything that's happened. By the way, just a little interjection. Have you noticed it's been almost 3 weeks and the president of Ukraine has still yet to receive a phone call from Biden?
They're freaking out.
Yeah.
they're freaking out. They got a phone call between the foreign minister and the secretary of state, though.
That doesn't count.
I'm well aware. We've been taking lots of phone calls from Kiev, and they want to know why they haven't gotten their phone call, why Moscow got the call first.
Well, you know, that's a very lack of signaling is also its own kind of signaling, as everyone understands. The Russians are very good at divide and conquer policies. The German population, let alone the German elites, do not want a harsh policy. Nord Stream 2 is very divisive. You now have a large movement in the European Parliament to connect Navalny directly, to couple Navalny directly to sanctions on Nord Stream 2. There are obviously people who are not on board with that. It's only like 120 or 150 kilometers that the Russians are missing. I think if everyone doesn't know about Nord Stream 2, this is the pipeline that the Russians want to put under the sea directly to Germany, so they can pipe 55 billion cubic meters of gas to the Germans and bypass Ukraine, thus not giving the Ukrainians between $2.5 and $3 billion in transition fees. It's both a political and economic leverage point on the Europeans, and decreases costs for Ukraine, and it makes big problems for the internal cohesion of the European allies. So it's bad. There are obviously people in Europe. I'm not talking about the people in London, who are some of them who British elites are online now, like Lord Risby. Obviously, you are our friends, but the Germans are very much a problem. If anyone didn't notice, but the president of Germany today said that Germany owes Nord Stream 2 to the Russians because of the debt to Nazism and World War II, which is completely crazy. You would deprive the Belarusians and the Ukrainians of regional security in favor of Moscow. When, you know, if we're going to play this game, which is very vulgar anyway, but more Belarusians and Ukrainians died during World War II than did Russian members of the Red Army. It's a very unpleasant conversation to get into, but we should kind of avoid. But if you're going to have the president of Germany say that we owe Nord Stream 2 to Moscow because of our guilt, I mean, we in Kiev too can play guilt games, you know?
Yes, yes. Vlad, thank you so very much. This is a really interesting conversation. Like I said at the beginning, the story is going to keep evolving. I think that Sophie's going to have you back for an update on Minsk, an update on Navalny, an update on Ukraine. It's never a dull moment in the Eurasia space. So thank you for this opportunity. And now to you, Sophie. Thank you for the invitation. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you very much. Melinda will speak together at the end of the Q&A. So we have a few questions from King's College alumni. The first one is, can we imagine a scenario where the army steps in? Is Navalny supported by generals? This would look to us the only way to trump Putin.
Yeah, the Russian elite at this point is still quite cohesive, and the security forces are still very much on the side of the regime. I don't see that happening yet. It would take another 6 months, 12 months of all sorts of bad things happening, maybe even a year and a half. There's going to be elections in the autumn. The generals are very much not going to do anything now. That's just a non-starter at this moment.
Second question from King's College alumni again. How do the US administration see the current situation evolving? Are they betting this is the moment to change things or just another occasion to throw critics?
So they did, I think it was good for everybody. They did re-ink the New START treaty, which got that out of the way. There were people in Washington, D.C. who thought that you had an either-or situation. You either had to go with sanctions or you had to re-ink the START ballistic missile treaty, which expired on February 5th or 4th, I think. Until that was done, for a very long time, that was something that got in the way of other kinds of sanctions or conversations about other kinds of sanctions or conversations about other kinds of methods. That needed to be out of the way. And so now that that's done, the Biden administration is very much chomping to go hard. There are people who are less or more hawkish inside the Biden team. They've actually brought a lot of the late Obama people back into power, including Victoria Nuland. I think there is going to be a fourth package of sanctions, and I do think that Moscow is not thrilled about the fact that they're going to have a lot more pushback now. But it yet remains to be seen if those costs, which are going to be ratcheted, are enough in order to nudge, in a Cass Sunstein sense, Moscow's direction in one direction or another.
Thank you. James Prince, what can or should the new Biden administration do to support Navalny and reformist forces, journalists, etc. in Russia?
Russia's made actually giving money and expertise like straight on illegal. So unlike sending, not that Washington, D.C. should send arms to Russia. That's crazy, and that's not going to happen, obviously. And even sending money or support for civil society organizations, that's also not going to happen. Diplomatic pressure, sanctions on the international level, they do care about their international reputation. They do care about not being pariahs. They do care about being, quote unquote, unhandshakable. When the Australian Prime Minister, I think it was, gentleman's name was Howard, came up to Putin and said, "I'll shake your hand, but get the hell out of Crimea, get the hell out of Ukraine." They don't like that kind of thing. They're very much into being respected. Russians don't like being disrespected. Russia has, for many hundreds of years, had a superiority-inferiority complex relationship to Europe. No one likes, especially very proud people, likes being disrespected. There is a certain amount of publicly calibrated sanctioning and hand-waving and finger-waving that we can get away with, that will shape the relationship and shape behavior. But at a certain point, they will snap back and behave aggressively. So you have to be very careful if you want results.
Thank you. Also, there is a question. Can we speak of a democratic defrost, like what's happening now? Could we consider that this is the power of the powerless, as said Václav Havel, according to you?
There are protests going on all across Eastern Europe. So there's an Eastern European protest belt, right, which is now flaring up. So in a way, that's true. That the transition from communism to democratic liberalism or democratic capitalism or modernity, or whatever you want to call it, has come to kind of its midpoint, right? And in transition theory, it's between 50 to 100 years. And we're halfway there. Is it people power in the Vaclavian sense? I don't know about that. I mean, I think it's very particular to Belarus and Russia, where these are ossified regimes that have been in power for 20 years, and they're running out of steam, and they're no longer offering people what they want in terms of services. So people are just getting tired of seeing the same man be in power for year after year. 40% of the young protesters at these protests over the last 3 weeks, they'd never been to a protest before, and when they were born, President Putin was already president. They've never known another country. He's been they're 21 years old, 20 years old, 19 years old. He's always been president.
Also, do you agree with Nicu Popescu's statements that adopting a tougher approach on Russia will yield stronger results, stronger links with Ukraine on security and the South Caucasus?
I think we're doing quite a lot for Ukraine, and it's good that we continue doing that. We should continue. As Melinda and I were just saying before, the Biden administration is not thrilled with Kyiv. Especially more and more texts are coming out that make it look like their side of the Giuliani situation. As CNN reported, I was a federal witness in that whole escapade. But it looks more and more like Kyiv played this kind of triple game where they didn't want to look like they were helping too much. They didn't want to look like they weren't helping at all. So they were in a bad situation. They made understandably bad decisions, impossible decisions in a bad situation. And now this administration is not going to abandon them, but they're going to let them be very anxious as they let them twist in the wind for a little bit. Understandably so. Are we going to increase defense cooperation and increase technical support for the modernization of the Ukrainian army? Yeah, that's good.
So do you think that you mean that Biden is too young in the office to play poker with Putin?
No, I mean, the whole context of American politics over the last 40 years has been so deeply and unnecessarily embedded in Russian and Ukrainian politics and the Ukrainization of Washington, D.C. and the Washington D.C.fication, let's say, of Kyiv, that there is so much bad blood accumulated. There's so much neurosis. There's so many conspiracy theories that for a long time, Kyiv and Moscow will look like radioactive zones in terms of what various people want to do. So there are a lot of people in responsible positions now in the Biden administration who want to go in and do more things. There are also a lot of people who say, enough already. That part of the world is very exhausting. And we've done quite a lot of it on CNN over the last 4 years.
Can Europe and the US launch a major combined cyber attack on Russia following the latter's continuous attacks on American softwares and firms?
Yeah, America certainly has that capacity. Americans have capacity to retaliate in whatever fashion that they want to, but the doing so tips their hand. You can only do certain things once before the Russians learn about certain kinds of techniques. So you don't want to do it unless it's a nuclear tactical strike option. Certainly they can. This administration prefers to start with sanctions before they do that kind of thing or increase costs in lots of ways. I wouldn't start with that myself if I was president of the United States, which I can't be since I was not born in the country.
And how about do you see the EU sanction Russia by not ordering the vaccine Sputnik despite its efficiency? What are your thoughts about this?
So there's already division on Sputnik within Eastern Europe and in Brussels. There's obviously not enough vaccine for everybody. Vaccine nationalism is a big issue, even between the Belgian, the French, and the British. 6 months ago we were all friends. Now we're stealing each other's vaccines. Very unpleasant.
Especially the UK.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. Yeah, It's very unpleasant, actually, what happened, and it shows that solidarity, in some cases, is skin deep. I wish that wasn't the case. Hungary has already green-lighted the vaccine. You know, the Ukrainians, on the other hand, passed a law on the national level saying they're not allowed to buy the vaccine. They're going to use Pfizer and the Chinese model. There are a lot of European countries who don't care. Like I don't think the Portuguese care at all about sanctions. They don't really care about the things that the Balts care about. Lithuania and Latvia has a Russian problem. Portugal does not have a Russia problem. Portugal will buy the vaccine if they need to. And if it means letting a cohesive response to Russian aggression go down the tubes, they're going to make the decision to save their own citizens before they make a decision to save Mr. Navalny.
Okay, that is an interesting. How do you call it? The virus nationalism?
Nationalism. Yeah.
Explain a little bit more. I understand, of course, but maybe into.
Nationalism's big now, and national borders are back, and national interest, naked national interests are back in a big way. That wasn't the case. I mean, it was probably always the case, but since the start of COVID, it's a big time case.
Okay, I'm sure that France will finally buy some Sputnik vaccine. Even if, according to me, it's not a good decision, but they will end by preferring to protect their citizens than other considerations. We have a question for anonymous attendee. Do you think Navalny has the ability to control Russia if he becomes president, despite the bribery?
He's very bright, and he's capable of making administrative decisions. I'm sure if he became president, he would rule the country adequately. But that's not the point. The point isn't to make Navalny president. The point is to use him as a tool in order to get fair and free elections, in order to get people to have a new kind of system where you have competitive elections and political parties, right? Even lots of Russians who support him don't necessarily want him as the president. I'm not sure I'd vote for him myself. He's a mechanism to bring forth changes. You don't necessarily need to be in favor of him becoming the commander-in-chief with a nuclear button, you know?
Yes, right. And do you see a closer partnership between Russia and China?
We're always going back and forth on that question. It is obvious that there are a lot of people in Russian national security circles who spend more time now in Beijing than they do in the West. That's always a bad thing. Yeah, that long term that is a problem. I mean, on the level of trade, obviously, Russians have a lot more trade and economic relationships with China than they do with Canada, right? Just geography.
Okay, we'll take a few more questions and then it will be the end of this thought-provoking talk. Question from Peter Weber. Does Putin intend to stay forever, or might he somehow engineer a succession so he can continue his control behind the scenes?
Hello, Peter. Peter's a friend of mine. He's a very well-known filmmaker. He's great. Everyone go watch Peter Weber's films. He's a credit to the British nation. The answer to that question is that Putin has an MO that we've seen over 20 years. He always makes decisions in more or less the same way. He keeps his cards close to his chest. He doesn't tell his close associates anything. He engineers 3 or 4 or usually 2 different directions with a decision fork. And at the last moment, he makes a snap decision after keeping everybody off balance. And that decision is implemented very, very, very quickly. So we see this very often with the third term, with changing the constitution. Almost always he does the same thing. That's just how he likes to operate. That's a psychological MO. I do think that he's going to either create a federation council on which he is going to be the supreme arbiter, because he's bored and he doesn't want to continue doing day-to-day boring bureaucratic legalese things until the end of time. He wants all the power. He wants to keep his wealth. He wants to control the situation without doing all the boring things. So there's one way to do that, which is to create a tepid successor who is weak, and you could just have him give speeches while you're making all the decisions, or you can rewrite the constitution and stay in power forever. That's what the Belarus annexation scenario was always about, although that didn't work out ultimately. I do think he's, in the long term, going to get bored of day-to-day activity going into the Kremlin and writing bills and taking photographs and meeting prime ministers from South America. I do think he's going to recede later in life, but I don't think he's made a decision yet, and certainly hasn't told anybody.
Right. Maybe, Lord, we have the pleasure to have the Lord Risby on this conversation. Maybe, the Lord Risby, you would like to ask a question in oral?
Thank you very much indeed, and it's always a treat to hear from you and have your insights. There are a couple of things I just would mention. Certainly, when Zelensky was here on his official visit, we have really, not only publicly but quite privately, we really do try to help them from a military intelligence and everything point of view. And we've sort of moved NATO in that direction. So we have a good relationship with them now, and we signed a trade agreement. But what I wanted to say is this: the interesting thing about Biden, and I take your point about a further range of sanctions, is that he does understand, after the somewhat erratic presidency of his predecessor, that there has to be a cooperation by like-minded people to deal with any situation at all. So, for example, on China, clearly this has been very wake-up call the last few years. So the Australians, New Zealanders, the Five Eyes, this is all, and I've heard Victoria Nuland talk about this before, before he became president. So I think what will be interesting to watch what he does, that despite the fact that the Germans have Nord Stream 2 and their divisions within Europe on attitudes to Russia, I think that what he may well do is realize that unless there's to attempt to get some sort of collective whole view over a period of time to deal with this, not just sanctions, but in a whole variety of ways, and try to bring other people in. I don't know, because Russia is neutral for many, many people, certainly not ourselves, because they do tend to kill British residents from time to time. But that is my point. I think we may just see an evolution of a more sophisticated foreign policy, which may include Russia. It certainly is going to include China, that is for sure. Merci, Sophie.
Merci, Lord Risby. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for attending. So we reached to our conclusion, because it's almost 7 in London. Thank you very much, Vladislav, for this thought-provoking talk. Thank you very much, Melinda, for interviewing Vlad. If you have a few words to say about this as a conclusion.
I think Lord Risby is right on in a lot of the messages we've heard early on with President Biden and Secretary Blinken. I'm sort of struck by how focused they are on China. So I don't know that they're going to spend a huge amount of time on Russia. I was glad to see last week that President Biden did mention Navalny, and he said that the easy days are behind us. But I'm a little worried, as someone who follows Russia and Ukraine, that this new administration is going to be very heavily focused on Europe and China.
I do agree. I mean, the Trump people did a lot of useful things in, let's say, crude and nasty ways, but there's no going back to 2015. There's Paradise Lost. We're not going to go back to that. The innovations in the understanding, the popular understanding of what our relationship to China is, are not going away, and Russia is on a particular track, and it's hard when you've got track dependency and path dependency to change things. There is no trust. We're not going to go back to things as they were in 2015 and 16. It's not to say that things are completely immutable, that things are existentially going to change, not change, but it seems that the situation that we're in for the time being is the new normal, and we're going to have to get used to it, and we're going to have to show a lot more solidarity with each other. So thank you, Melinda, my boss at the Atlantic Council. Thank you, Sophie, for putting all this together. It's been a great talk. Really lovely to talk to all these nice people.
Yes, it was really a very, very interesting talk, and we don't hear this in the common news or newspaper. So it was really, really interesting. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for all the attendees, and hope to see you soon in our future next talk. Thank you very much. Bye to Washington. Bye to Paris. Thank you, dear Lord Risby. Thank you to King's College alumni and London School of Economics students too, and all our members. Thank you very much.